All right, I want to thank you, first of all, for your patience in dealing with my recovery from the detached retina. I still am not seeing very well, so some things might be delayed still, but I'll do my best to stay on track and get you grades and answers to questions as quickly as I can. But again, I appreciate your patience regarding this. This is an important class, right? Because this time, this class, we're actually, in this particular lecture, we're going to look at like the whole point of this class, or at least going to start looking at the whole point of this class. I mean, what we did so far, consider that the prelude. And today we're really going to get into database interactivity. So what we're going to do is we are going to connect our ASP.NET Razor pages to a database. All right. Now, a few things to keep in mind. That typically you have your application in whatever language you have, and then you have your database over here. Right. Typically, the DBMS is the only program that accesses a database directly. For everything else, there's an intermediary. And in the past, there were a set of these drivers that allowed you to talk back and forth between your application and the database. The input that you'd send over to the database was a request, typically involving some SQL. Those of you that had CISS243, you probably at least were exposed to some degree of SQL. So you had to write code in SQL, and that got sent over to the database, and you got back, depending on what the SQL was, any number of things. You might have gotten back a record set, for example, a list of records that match your query, or you might have gotten a status code saying, did the update work or not, or whatever. ASP.NET Core sort of changes things up a little bit. I'll put old over here. This is sort of the old way. Here in ASP.NET, ASP.NET Core, you have a set of classes that are defined, and they're called a model. Now, model is used a couple different ways when we talk about ASP.NET Razor pages, and hopefully the difference between the two will come clear. These are associated, these classes become associated with, I kind of ran out of space here, a web context, which essentially ties it to a specific database. And the way in ASP.NET Core is that it works is when you manipulate these classes have a direct line to the database, and they parallel the database. They work in tandem with the database. They're synced up is probably the best way to put it. So you might have a customer class here, and that will correspond to a customer table in the database. Now, it gets more complicated than that, especially when you get into relationships between multiple tables. But in the simplest form, we have a class that corresponds to a table. And by performing operations on that class, like adding something to that class, we actually end up adding it to the database, changing something in the class, deleting, getting a list of those customer objects, and so on. We're actually accessing the database. So these two have to be in sync. Now, there's two ways that you can do this. We're going to do one of them, but I think it's important to hear both of them. One of them is called the code first approach. And that is where you create the the C# classes in your ASP.NET Pro project. And those are used to generate your database. So in this case, we don't go into the database and create the database first. We create the classes that correspond to the tables that we want in our database. And then we generate the database from that. And we'll see this in the process that we do today. The other way would be database first. And that's where you create the database first, and that's used to generate these classes. Now, we're using this approach. And this approach, I would argue, is probably better when you're starting off from scratch. If you're part of an organization and they already have a SQL Server database, then maybe you would, if they already have that defined, maybe you would use the database first approach because you already have a database that's been built and has been working and so on. But here we're starting everything from scratch, so we're going to do the code first approach. Okay? So we're going to run through this tutorial, and your lab that's due next week is to do this tutorial, except you're going to go farther in the tutorial than I do. All right, I just want to get it started to give you an idea how to run the tutorial, but I know you can follow directions. My main point is to talk about each step that we do and to talk about how it corresponds to this and that previous screen that I had of the classes and the database. So we're going to do this tutorial. Also, I've just posted to Canvas this in next week's list of resources, a more advanced talk about ASP.NET Razor pages. And that shows you sort of the same thing that we're talking about this case, but more on a nuts and bolts level, more, showing if you're doing things manually, because we're going to use a technique called scaffolding. That is really cool. Okay, so read through all this. The first thing I'm interested in is adding a model. Now, this is a different model than the model that's associated with the page. In fact, I'm going to call those page models. So if you remember last week or previous weeks, when we had a Razor page, we had a .cshtml file and a .cshtml.cs file. And I said the .cs file was the model. More completely, to say that is a page model. In other words, that is tied to a particular page, and that's the code that exists for that particular page. In this case, we're creating a model, which is, I guess you would call it an entity model. It's a model of one of the entities within your organization that you're interested in. This more usually is going to get translated into a database table. So we're going to create a movie model that contains the information about a movie. Where did that code go? Oh, here we go. So I'm going to copy that. So how do we do this? I'm going to go to Visual Studio. It does its thing. I'm going to come up here and say New Project. I'm going to pick what we picked before, the ASP.NET Core web app with Razor Pages. Click Next. I'm going to give it a name. Razor Pages Movie. Now, you don't have to give it that name. There's nothing magical about that name. But if you give it that name, then your example will match up with the example in the tutorial. So it's probably better to do that. We can pick a location of where we want to save it. You should have a folder for each of your labs that you're working on. And so you'll save it there. I'm going to just save it on the desktop. Click Next. Framework, ASP.NET 8.0. Yeah, pick that one. There is a preview version 9.0, but I would avoid the preview version. So pick ASP.NET, the .NET 8.0. Authentication type, we're going to say none for that. Authentication, again, relates to logging on. And if you think about it, that's something that's very important, right? We're developing a movie database. Well, we certainly wouldn't want anyone on the internet to be able to go in and add movies, change movies, whatever, right? We would only want authorized people to be able to go in and make changes to our movie database. But we're not quite right at there yet. So we're going to leave authentication as none, and that'll be something we come back to. Click Create. It's going to do its thing, just like it did in previous weeks. It's going to generate all those files. All right. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a folder for our models. So I right mouse and say Add Folder, and I'm going to call it Models. Now again, these are our entity models. These are models that have the code that represent our entities within our organization. These are different than the page models, which the page models contain information and code related to a specific Razor page. Okay, so I do that. I'm going to go add an item. And I'm going to call it movie.cs. One thing for your own sanity purpose, make the object or the class name that you're creating here singular. So I'm saying movie, so one movie. Later on, when we create our pages, we're going to call the pages movies. All right. I've noticed, especially in the past, there's difficulty if you name them the exact same thing. So I don't know if that's still a problem, but I'm not going to tempt fate. Right? I'm going to call the class. Again, the class represents one instance of this entity. So it represents a single movie. And the movies pages are going to contain just information that we query about a bunch of pages. So movies.cs. I'm going to click Add. And it's going to create this. I copied from the tutorial. Zoom. See Zoom. I hope this is big enough for you to read. I'm going to paste in this. Now we're going to study these in more detail, but let's take a brief look at them and talk about the database table that this is going to generate. All right, public class movie, and the movie consists of several attributes. A public int ID. And those of you who've taken C# before probably have seen properties like this defined. All right. Public string title. The question mark after string indicates that it is not a required field, which may seem odd. How you're going to have a movie without a title, but it is an optional field. Public date time, release date. And again, none of these have custom getters or setters. They're just using the generic, so we don't do any special processing when we set these properties. We can treat them just like variables. Genre is also an optional string. And finally, the decimal for price. So those are the 5 attributes that exist for this. Now, if you've taken the database class, you know that every table ought to have a primary key. The primary key that is a column or collection of columns that uniquely identifies a member of that database. Now, in this case, the ID is going to be the primary key. How do we know that? Because there's nothing in here that says that. All right. It is by convention. If you name a field ID, or if you named it movie ID, when we go and generate the database from this model, it's going to be smart enough to pick up and say that this is the primary key of this table. So even though we don't have anything in there, it's going to create an auto number key for this table called ID. All right. Let's save it. Now, all right, next thing we're going to do is we're going to do what's called scaffolding. Scaffolding is, if you think of a scaffold, it's something that you can use to build something with. It's a framework that you can use to build on things. And if you think about it, most entities in your database are going to need what's called CRUD functionality. It's an unfortunate name, but CRUD, create, retrieve or read, update, and delete. So in an application where there's movies, where we're keeping track of movies, we're going to need to create a movie, that is, create a new one. We're going to need to retrieve or read movies from the database. We're going to need to update them, and we're going to need to delete them. So the good thing is you get this generic set of pages, a create, a retrieve, 5 pages, a create, a retrieve, a create, an edit, a view, delete. Keep thinking there's one more. Oh, and a listing of these. So we get these 5 pages for very easy. It actually generates for that. Now, that doesn't mean that all your work is done for you, unfortunately, because you're going to have to go and you're going to have to make sure everything is set up correctly. And you're going to have to, in many cases, make changes to the code that was generated. So you do have to understand this, and you do have to understand it in a bit of detail to be able to use this. But the good thing is this gives you a good head start towards it. All right. So I'm going to go here. I'm going to create a folder in Pages, called Movies. Again, this is the plural because this is going to help me, this is going to allow me to deal with all movies, not just a single movie. So this will have a listing of all the movies in it. Again, I do that to keep this name different than this name. The entity model I'm calling singular. The folder where the pages live are going to be plural. Now, I'm going to right mouse and I'm going to say add, and I'm going to pick new scaffolded item. And this is where we say exactly what we want. And there's a lot of things we want, and at the very bottom of the list is Razor pages using the CRUD framework, using the create, read, update, and delete. So I right mouse on the folder that I created for movies. I go and I click this and click add. Now we get asked a series of questions. What model do we want to create these create, delete, details, edit, list from? We want to do it from the movie model. So if you had more than one model, you would select what entity you wanted to be able to maintain using these pages. The database context. This is where we associate this class and the entity and the actual database that this is going to belong in. So that's called a database context, and we give that a name. Now, in the first several examples, we're going to have only one context because we're going to put everything in just one database. Later on, when we get into authentication, we're going to have, we'll potentially have multiple databases, but we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. Right now, we're going to keep it simple. Click plus, it will give you sort of a default name. That looks good enough for me. Click add. And the type of database provider, there's SQL Server, there's also SQLite, and some other kinds of databases. Now, if you are a Mac user and you're doing this on Mac, I have a video created, I think I have a video created for it, and I have a resource for this. But you cannot use SQL Server, all right? I see there's one Mac user out there, and we can talk about it more, but you have a couple of choices, one of which is to run Visual Studio on the Mac side of things. Problem with that is that product was discontinued. I think you're still going to be able to download it. And if you can't, let me know and I'll see if I can find it somewhere out there. Did you download it?
Are you talking about Visual Studio?
Visual Studio.
Yeah, I can't download it.
You can't download it?
Yeah, but I have a PC at my house for Windows,
Okay.
so I just do that.
Yeah, all right. That'll keep things simple. But if you do have a Mac, one of the options is to run something like Parallels, and then you can run a Windows machine on it and do that. There is a catch when you run Parallels though on a Mac about the database driver that you have to use. If any of you, point is, if any of you are running a Mac and plan to run this on a Mac, let me know and I can help you work through it. But for people running this on Windows, the selection is SQL Server. All right, that's okay, and we click add. And we sit back and sip our coffee and wait for it to do its thing. It's actually writing those pages. And it's creating the database context. You'll notice that now we have data, in the data folder, we have our database context, which contains our one entity that exists. I think that's the only file created. Well, that's the only folder created. Notice what it did though in our movies folder. It has a create, delete, details, edit, and index. All right. So we have our 5 programs, but we can't run it yet. We can't run it yet because we have created our database context and we've created our model. We have not yet generated our database. And that's what we need to do. So I'm going to go up to Tools. New Get Package Manager, Package Manager Console. And I'm going to do a couple things. First thing I'm going to do is create a migration. A migration is saying from where the database last was, let's include all the updates made to the database structure. So for example, if we already had 2 database tables in there, this would add our new one, movies, because it's sort of a, it's sort of a rolling thing that, you start off with an empty database, you then create a migration and post that migration to the database. That creates your database as of that point in time. The next migration that you create will contain all the updates made since that point when you created the database the first time, and so on. This occasionally gets sticky sometimes, and sometimes you might, I've had students ask for help of getting out of sort of these messes, especially if you go back and delete things or whatever. But anyhow, you create a migration by saying add migration and give it a name. And I'm going to call it initial migration. All right. Initial migration, it tells you what this is. This is where we're setting up the database for the very first time. Click return. And it gives us some warning messages, but other than that, we're okay. It does create this migrations folder, and we can see a snapshot of the database, and we can see snapshot of the database when this migration is posted, and the migration shows the change it's going to make. The change it's going to make is it's going to add the movie table to the database. If we reverse this migration, we would end up deleting that table. I think it says that somewhere. Oh yeah, to undo this action, use remove migration. That's if you create a migration and decided something was wrong and didn't want to fix it. Instead, you just wanted to kind of undo. The last thing we're going to do is we're going to create the database, or we're actually going to update the database. This is where it's going to take all those migration files and all our models and all that stuff and actually create the corresponding database tables for them. Maybe. It just told me you got an error, it didn't tell me what the error is. Oh. I ended up accidentally typing something when I was looking at that migration. Had me worried there for a second. I was like, how could this go wrong? I tested it right before lunch and everything went okay. Okay, So if you get an error like that, try running it, and it usually gives you some sort of message as to what's wrong. This will happen if you have a syntax error in your code, or if you had something defined incorrectly in your model. All right, we'll try take 2. And we'll try to update the database. There we go. That's what we want to see. And it sort of shows you what it's doing. It creates that table. And we have in the database our table. How can we see that database if we want to? Well, if you're running Windows and running the newest version of SQL Server, you can go under View, say SQL Server Object Explorer, and look, and there is our table got created. Now, this being said, generally you don't want to mess around going into the database. Sometimes that's helpful for troubleshooting or for fixing a problem, but you can sort of mess things up if you mess up the database, if you make a change that you're not supposed to do. But I did want to show you that, yes, it creates a database, and yes, it created that table. And if we look at that table, it created the columns that we have in the database. As is mentioned here, PK, that becomes a primary key. Okay, we're ready to run. But not yet. We haven't added it to our menu. And this is important to do this because you don't want me guessing where your web page is. You want to give me a nice link to it. And you probably want that to appear on every single page that you have. Therefore, you're going to want to put it in the layout CSS_HTML. So I'm going to go find the other links. And again, I would suggest for this, like, other than this tutorial example, for other examples, go ahead and make an actual home page for what we're doing. The link text I'm going to give as movies. And I'm going to give the name of is the directory that it's in. So from the root, I go to the movies directory, and I want the index file. So I want this page to display. Whoops. I want that page to display when I click on this link. Notice we don't have the CSS_HTML after it. All right. There's a mapping that tells the framework that index really means index.CSS_HTML. Pull that from the pages from this directory, movies, and pull the index.CSS_HTML and go do your thing. So now, everything went okay. We should have something operational. We're going to get an error here. Oh, no, we don't. Oh, we don't. Because I ran it to Microsoft Edge. There's a problem the way these machines are set up that we get an error when I try to run it in Chrome. Anyhow, I guess I did change it when I was practicing earlier. Movies. Click on movies, I get this blank screen. Now it's going to become very familiar to you because everything that you scaffold is going to follow this format. You create new, give it a title, release date, genre, and price. So name, Star Wars. Release date, I don't remember, but it was a long time ago, 07/04. I'm gonna guess 1976. Genre, sci-fi. If you're really a database, if you're really up on your database, you know that you probably would make genre a related table and not just have someone key it in every time. But we're not at that point yet. And price, well, we can type in some price. Notice if we type in garbage, we get this message. It's smart enough to know when it scaffolds it that this field, being numeric, has to have a numeric value. Likewise, we give nothing. Because we didn't make this an optional field, we have to put something in. So we're going to put a price in, create, and there we are on the listing. So when we go to this list, it will show every movie that we've added. We have our create to add a new one. We have our edit to modify it. We have our details, which is just showing the list of all the fields associated with that entity. Now, why might you have an edit and a details? Well, certain users may not be allowed to edit, but might be allowed to see the details, for example. You know, there might only be one person that in the payroll department that can change people's salaries, but other people might need to see information about a particular employee. And finally, we have delete. Now, there's more in the tutorial than this. They talk about seeding the database. So in other words, initializing it and putting some values in. And I also want you to create a second entity called actors. Now, when you create that entity, you'll just follow the process that we did. All right. And create that entity, create the model for it. Put in the fields for it. You can use the movies as an example. When you create the database context, do not create a new database context. Just put everything in the existing database context. So you'll use the same database context as you did for the movies. Trying to think if anything else, but yeah, and I think they have you add a search too. But it's a good thing to sort of review. Now, since I know that all of you are only taking this one class and therefore you have endless time to kill looking at stuff for this class, if you have time, do a couple things. One, review this more advanced information. Now, technically it's in the week 5 folder, but review it. The other thing to review, and we'll do this in upcoming classes, is actually review the scaffolded code. That's a good way to test your learning, or help you learn rather. So for example, look at, and probably the one that we'll start out with will be the index. So look at the index CSS_HTML and CSS_HTML.cs. And sort of get yourself acclimated to how these kind of things work. And we'll just talk about this one for a minute. This one, notice that there's a list of movies associated with this model. And what we do is we set that list of movies to pulling from the database context, that is pulling from the database, a list of all the movies. So that movie object that we create here, it's going to end up with a list of all the movies. Then the CSS HTML is going to loop through that list and display for each item in turn the first, the title, the release date, the genre, and the price, and create these other links for it. So take some time to review it. Some of it might be a little hard to understand at first. We will go through some of this in class, but it's important to know that because not everything in this course or in life you'll be able to simply scaffold and have a complete solution. You'll have to do some customizing of the code to work in your particular situation. Are there any questions? All right, that's all I had today. We'll either see you in lab or see you next week.